the first one. The first speaker today is Frank Smets, who is Director General of the Directorate General Research of the European Central Bank. He's Professor of International Economics at Leuven, and also he has the Duesenberg Chair at the University of Groningen, and is currently visiting the BIS. And then Refek Gurkainak, Professor of Economics and the Chair of the Economics Department at Bilkent University, and he is a Research Fellow at the Center of Economic Policy Research. We have one remaining speaker who is not here yet. I'll introduce him later. Frank Smets is presenting today the paper Sectoral Shocks and the Persistence of Inflation. And well, Frank, the floor is yours. The presentation is expected to last 30 minutes, and then we can have 15 minutes discussion, possibly involving the other speakers as well. Please go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patricio, and thank you, Claudio, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to participate in this workshop. Let me just make sure you see the presentation. Okay, so I think this should work. Let me say that well, the title of the presentation is Sectoral Shocks and the Persistence of Inflation, and this a big part of what I am going to say is based on joint work with Joris Stielens at the National Bank of Belgium and Jan van Hoven. And it's actually based on some older work that we did in 2018 that we're now sort of updating. Let me also remind you about the disclaimer that the views expressed are my own and not necessarily those of the ECB. I'm no longer Director General Research, so I'm basically an advisor now at ECB, and currently actually at the BIS as a Lamfalussy Fellow. So this is kind of the outline for the talk. So I don't think I need to spend much time on the motivation. The bulk of the presentation will sort of present some preliminary results from this research project with Joris Stielens on pipeline pressures and the persistence of inflation. And then towards the end, I just have a few slides about sort of the broader discussion about what drives the persistent inflation effects of sectoral shocks, and also some of the monetary policy implications. Now, the motivation, I mean, inflation, of course, has turned out to be much higher and much more persistent than many of us originally expected. And here I sort of refer to this sort of debate early on in 2021 between what was sometimes called the temporary camp, in which actually many central bankers were, including myself, I should say, which thought that, okay, the current rising inflation is mostly due to sectoral shocks, to relative price changes. And these are likely, once the price has adjusted, the relative price level has adjusted, they should sort of naturally fall out of the headline inflation numbers. And so given the source of this shock, the impact of inflation should be temporary. Whereas, of course, there were other people, I mean, Summers, Blanchard, Ricardo Reis, that thought that part of that inflation relatively early on was also coming from very accommodative fiscal and monetary policy, which spurs demands, which may lead to buoyant labor markets, increased wage inflation, which typically would have more persistent effects of inflation on inflation and different implications for the monetary policy response. Now, I mean, early on, I think the kind of the difference between those two camps was partly based, as I mentioned, on a different assessment of what were the main drivers of the rise of inflation. And so now, when we look back now, and after obviously seeing that the persistent camp definitely was right, and the temporary camp was wrong in the sense that actual inflation turned out to be much more persistent. There's a question: okay, what were the reasons for the way it turned out? And of course, there can be two. And I'm simplifying here the discussion. Of course, there can be two reasons. One reason is that yes, we know there have been sectoral shocks, but we kind of underestimated the persistence of these shocks, or the persistent effects they would have on inflation, the pass-through, the feed-through of these shocks into the economy and into headline inflation. So that's one kind of interpretation of what happened. The other one is that the demand forces indeed have turned out to be more inflationary, and particularly in an environment which maybe was not appreciated as much as we do now, post-pandemic or pandemic-related environment, where there were many supply constraints, and particularly we saw a lot of reallocation, and particularly from services to goods and back, and also in terms of the international supply constraints. So you had increased demand with a constrained supply, leading to much higher inflation and inflation persistence than maybe we would have thought would have happened in normal conditions. Now, what my talk will be on this first part, so on how persistence, have we underestimated the persistence of some of these relative price shocks? I don't want to imply that that's the only reason why we have seen inflation. I think in reality, it is a combination of demand and supply factors. And again, there's a lot of ongoing empirical research pointing to that. But I want to focus in my presentation on, okay, maybe we have also underestimated some of the persistent effects of these relative price shocks. And in order to give a little bit more sort of color to that hypothesis, I just took a few graphs here from a recent blog that Philip Lane has written in December. Philip Lane, the chief economist of the ECB, going through some of the mechanics of current inflation in the ECB. So what you see in sort of this middle panel is actual inflation in the euro area. I mean, it's not completely up to date. I mean, we are now sort of more around 9%. The sort of headline inflation is the dark blue line. And then the four other lines are basically the four main components. The light blue line is energy inflation, but be aware that energy inflation has its own axis on the right-hand side. So whereas all the other series go from 0 to 9%, the energy goes from 0 to 50%. So the actual inflation rate at the end, this is the third quarter of 2022, was 40% for energy inflation, so much higher if you would use. Is that food price inflation has been going up sort of more recently than energy price inflation, but also core inflation, both goods, which is the red line, and services, green line, have been going up. So suggesting that it's maybe is not just about what is happening to these volatile series like energy and food, but there's definitely also something going on in core inflation. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, there are some decompositions that colleagues at ECB have made, trying to distinguish between energy-intensive good sectors and less energy-intensive good sectors. and the same for services, which is the lower part. And of course, you see that actually a quite big part of the rise in core inflation is coming from the red bars, and particularly in services, which is sort of the more energy intensive, suggesting that it's not just about supply and demand driving kind of, for example, wages and bringing up core inflation. There's also a component of pass-through from energy price inflation and to some extent, well, in this case, it's energy price to core inflation. And so again, that's what I want to focus on in this presentation. Now, there is a literature on this, on what is the contribution of relative price shocks or sector-specific shocks to the volatility and the persistence of headline inflation. And there are a number of references that you will see there at the bottom, which are sort of well-known papers by Boivin, by Markowiak and Wiederholt, Carvalho, or Altissimo. They basically, you all use the same kind of methodology, which is a dynamic factor model to try to get at that question. So the two big picture questions are, which part causes persistence? Is it macro or micro? And which part explains variations? Is it macro or micro? And so the way this methodology works is you estimate a dynamic factor model on the whole series of sectoral prices. And what we will be looking at will be US sectoral price series around 70, both in the production sector and in the consumption sector. And then you use the dynamic factor model to distinguish between the common components. So these are factors that commonly drive all those sectoral price series, and what is called the more idiosyncratic component. So that's the component that mostly affects a specific sector. And the question is, what is the contribution of the common, say, the macro shocks, which are often interpreted as macro shocks, to the persistence of inflation and volatility versus the micro shocks. And one of those will be, for example, the energy sector or parts of the energy sector. And of course, the headlines here is just a weighted average of all these sectoral price series. So that's the second line that you have. So what I will do next in this presentation is first just replicate what many of these papers that you see on the bottom have found, and this we will just find the same thing. So that will just confirm that literature, and then argue that maybe this is not the best way of trying to get at that question, whether sectoral shocks, how much sort of sectoral shocks contribute to the persistence of headline inflation. For that, we will use, US data, 75 consumer price indices. So that's basically different sectors in the sort of PCE index, 65 producer prices. So that's more in the production sector, monthly frequency. You have the time series, the sample there. There's some issues also with not all of them start at the same time. That's not so important. So that's the data that we will use. So all the analysis so far, but in future research we will kind of enlarge this to also quantity data. But so far we just look at prices and price indices and inflation indices as the literature has done. Now, if you estimate sort of a standard dynamic factor model, just on this set of, what is it, 130 plus sectoral price inflation indices, and you do this decomposition, then you get the type of impulse responses that you see on this graph. So the left-hand one gives you the response of all these sectors to the common component. And here we will just have one important common component. Again, this captures a lot of the variability, and you will see it. But of course, these are all price indices. So if we would add also production, then of course more than one factor will be important. In this case, it's just one factor. And on the right-hand side, you see the responses to the idiosyncratic components. Now, one thing that you already see, and then again, the responses are here are to the levels, not to the inflation rates, is that there is more persistence in response to the common component than to the idiosyncratic shocks. And so in order to sort of show that more clearly, we have the pictures here. We basically calculate the speed of response. And of course, there are different ways you can do that. You can look at half-life. I mean, here we just look at the percentage of the long-run impact of the shock that is materialized in the first quarter. So if there's no persistence at all, this is 1. So you have an immediate impact, and then it basically stays at that level. And on the right-hand side, you see the distribution across all these sectors of this measure of the speed of response. And you see it's very much concentrated at 1. So the sectoral shocks basically have no persistence. There's a one-off effect, more or less, and then the shock dies out. And of course, that translates also in the headline indices, the weighted average indices, which are the red and orange line for the PCE index and the PPI index. On the left-hand side, you see the distribution across sectors of this measure of persistence in response to the common shock. And there you see there's a much wider distribution. Actually, the median is more between 0.5 and 0.6. So only half of the long-term impact takes place in the first period, and there is a whole distribution. And of course, that also translates in this case for the persistence, the contribution of the persistence to the headline inflation, which is of the same order. And so this is very much kind of summarizes the outcome of this literature I referred to, and the conventional wisdom that kind of was partly based on this literature. First, that sector shocks do not create persistence, either on disaggregate inflation indices or on headline inflation. And secondly, that it is the aggregate shocks, which in a lot of literature are interpreted as the macro shocks, that create persistence both in this aggregate and headline inflation. What about the volatility and the variance of inflation dynamics? So here you see the variation explained by the common component. And so what you get is sort of the second part of sort of the conventional wisdom based on this literature, which is that sectoral shocks are the main drivers of volatility in disaggregate inflation indices. The common component for the median sectoral index explains only between 0.1 to 0.3% of the volatility of that sectoral shock, whereas aggregate shocks are the main driver of the volatility in headline inflation. And so that's where, again, the red line and the orange line are to the right, with an R-squared of 0.86, and for headline inflation of the PPI, even 0.97. So that was a big literature, and I think it kind of set a little bit the stage for this general notion that sectoral shocks have only temporary impacts on inflation. They're very important for sectoral prices, but not so important for headline inflation, because they sort of wash out. Now, of course, one immediate observation or criticism of this approach is that if a sectoral shock cascades through the economy, through the input-output production network, it may very well generate co-movement of prices. And if that co-movement is very important, then it will be picked up by the common component rather than by the idiosyncratic component. So the common component should be interpreted broader as not only coming from macro shocks, say monetary policy shocks, fiscal shocks, demand shocks, some aggregate productivity shocks, but also from the propagation of micro shocks. And so what we in this paper try to do is basically try to revisit this decomposition, these two stylized or conventional wisdoms, by trying to take that into account. And so what we want to go, as you see on the bottom of this slide, is from a decomposition where you say macro shocks and sector specific shocks to three-way decomposition, contribution of macro shocks, the own contribution of a sector shock, so the impact of the own shock on the sector, and then what we call pipeline pressures, which are the shocks of other sectoral shocks on sector I. And given our assumptions, the independence of those shocks, you can actually, decompose this inflation and also aggregate inflation in this way. Now, how do we do that? So there's no time to really go to the details of the methodology. So let me just very quickly go through the various steps. Basically, we first calibrate, actually it's based also partly on estimation, a DSG model where we actually explicitly account for all these input-output interactions. It's very much like a model that Michael Weber and co-authors have published in the JME not so long ago to look at the propagation of monetary policy shocks through the input-output chain. So we will have both the production input-output matrix, but also look at the 75 different PCE categories, and of course use the input-output tables and the bridge tables in this DSG model to build our model. So we'll use that information. We will also use the quite abundant information that there is about the degree of price stickiness that may differ in different of these sectors to calibrate the degree of price stickiness in each of those sectors. But otherwise, it's kind of a relatively standard new Keynesian DSG model. Now, this model you can write, you can solve as I said there, as basically an ARMA 2-1 model for this vector of inflation variables. So you have the expression there. So L is basically the lag operator. These different parameter matrices, they depend on the parameters of the model, and particularly on the input-output structure, but also the degrees of stickiness in the various sectors. And then the epsilon t, so we assume what is driving mostly the prices are cost-push shocks, so they're all markup shocks. So that's the epsilon t. Now, given the model, we can actually invert and retrieve the time series. So we have our observed inflation numbers, we have the model, we can retrieve the epsilon t's. So the shocks, the reduced form shocks to each of the sectors. So that's the third step. And then we do what the literature has done on the actual time series. We do the decomposition on those shocks. So we look at, is there a common component to this? So that's the lambda ST. And what is the micro component that shock. Once we have done that, we can actually feed it through the structure of the model and then do the exercise that we want to do, that is try to decompose the persistence and the variability to these three components that we want. Again, the macro shock, which will be the new ST here, the sector-specific shock on the own sector, and then all the other the shocks on all the other sector on the sector I, which again we call pipeline pressures, and that's sort of the part of inflation that is driven by the pass-through of sector-specific shocks through the input-output structure of the economy. And then we can do the same exercise as we did before. So we can look at the shocks, and you can already see here that this third component is actually has a degree of persistence which is very similar to the persistence of the common component. And this is basically what you also see in these pictures. So this is the same pictures as we had before, but now we have kind of decomposed through the lens of this input-output structure, the common component in a common component that is coming from aggregate shocks, and so truly common shocks, and a common component that is driven by sector-specific shocks that feed through the input-output matrix. And so you see that if we focus on the right-hand side, I mean, okay, let me just go directly to the main results here. So the novel insight 1A, so to say, is that no, aggregate shocks, once you do that, aggregate shocks remain an important source of persistence. So you see that indeed the share of the shock that takes place in the first period is still around 0.5, 0.6. It depends a bit on which indicator. As expected, you always think that the PCE index, which is really downstream from the PPI index, that is more persistent than we would expect. But the new insight is that the sectoral shocks, which is what you see on the right-hand side, through this sluggish cascading, also do create persistence, both for aggregate and disaggregate inflation numbers. So once you look through that lens, you basically come to the conclusion that actually sector-specific shocks have quite a degree of persistence and a persistent effect on headline inflation, which is actually quite similar. Now, again, not all of them, but you cannot sort of ignore them. What about the volatility? I mean, the volatility, basically, the results here say that micro shocks are important for headline inflation, exactly because they have these persistent effects. So they don't necessarily wash out, which of course is also a result in sort of the granularity literature that focuses more on output and the importance of sector shocks for output. Okay, so that's basically where we are in terms of the kind of the research project. I don't know, I think probably I'm running out of time, so I can be very quick on some of the other considerations, which is beyond this the research project. I mean, this is just to say, of course, you can look at specific sectors. Here is a reference to a recent paper that looks at the indirect network contribution of oil price changes in the US. And one of the findings of the paper is that actually these indirect effects are as important as the direct effects, and explained quite a bit of, in particularly the initial rise in core inflation in the US. Of course, there's many more things to be done, and particularly better understanding what are the exact factors behind persistent inflation effects of sectoral shocks. So which sectors and why do lead to persistent inflation. And here I just list a number of factors that will be important once you build and look at the various parameters of the model. Of course, the size and the persistence of the sector shocks itself, the position in the production network. So typically and intuitively, shocks that affect sectors that are upstream, and that are inputs to other sectors, typically will lead to more persistence than shocks to sectors that are completely downstream, like in the consumption index. The degree of price rigidity will be important, and also the interaction between where a sector is in the production network and the degree of price rigidity. For example, if a energy is a relatively flexible price sector, but of course it's a big input in many very sticky sectors. If that's the case, then again, it will give rise to persistent effects. Then there's a whole new literature that has emphasized the elasticity of substitution between different sectors. That will be very important. There's the issue of wage price spirals. Wages will be a key element once you take those into account. Inflation expectations, and of course the latter two will also be conditioned by the actual and expected monetary policy response. I will skip this discussion on the elasticity of substitution and just end with this last slide, which is really to refer to, I think, two very interesting, very recent papers that look at optimal monetary policy in an environment like the one we are using, also to try to quantify the pipeline pressures of sectoral shocks. And so the finding of these two papers is that in a production network economy with nominal rigidities, stabilizing sort of conventional inflation indices bears a significant welfare cost. Optimal monetary policy will want to stabilize a price index with higher weights assigned to more sticky sectors, to larger sectors, to more upstream industries, as well as industries with less sticky upstream suppliers. And of course, the basic intuition is the intuition that we know from simpler models that have looked at, multi-sector models that have looked at models with sectors and different degrees of price stickiness. And let me just end by saying, of course, this does have concrete monetary policy implications also for the current context, where we know some of the shocks, the origin of the sector-specific shocks. Now, one big, and I'll end with this, one big conclusion also of this literature, that in the end, the kind of optimal target price index needs to have a very large weight on nominal wages in this literature. Why? Because it has the largest donor weight, so it's the biggest component when you look at sort of contribution to sales. And wages are also known to be more stickier than most prices. And so both prices will actually increase. And so, for example, in the optimal price index that Elisa Hubo has calculated, 50% of the weight should be on nominal wages. And of course, that partly also justifies and maybe explains why central banks have been watching closely what's going on with wages. So let me stop here and see if there are any questions.
Okay, thanks, Franks. So we can take questions from the floor now. Okay, Karima Badir, you can speak, I think. Thank you. Now, Refet Gurkainak is presenting external shocks, self-inflicted wounds, and inflation control. So, Refet, the floor is yours. You can share the screen.
All right. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me share my screen right away and get started. I can. Here we are. Okay. So this naturally follows up from Frank's presentation, and I always strive to stand on the shoulder of giants, and in this case, did manage to do so. So it's going to be this. I'd like to offer not really research, but opinions on this, external shocks, transitoriness, whatnot, business. That's going to be the shorter bit. And then I'm going to tie it to self-inflicted wounds. And I'm going to tie that to the greatest self-inflicted wound of all, the Turkish monetary policy. And that's going to be the bulk of the talk. And it's hopefully interesting for everyone for a variety of reasons. One is, this is a wonderful country and everybody should know of it, but we've been running such a bizarre monetary policy experiment for so long that I'd like to make the case that the Turkish macro policy actually does fulfill the definition of exogenous change in policy. And so if you're interested in any kind of policy experiment and its results on a variety of things, this is a good case to know and track because Turkey has great data, micro data. So you may want to think about, what happens to labor markets, what happens to firm incorporation, whatnot, when, weird things happen. And I'm going to take that and relate it to neo-Fisherian disinflation and New Keynesian modeling and talk about under what conditions these may work together, okay? So there's some theory, hopefully that's going to afford some understanding. And then I'm going to use that to talk about the inflationary outcomes of monetary policy if you try a neo-Fisherian disinflation and fail, right? So the transitoriness bit is that, external shocks actually do happen, right? These aren't just our modeling contrivances. So Russia did invade Ukraine, and that was a huge external shock for everyone. And Frank was talking about that too, right? It's in part a large relative price shock, but in part just a damn huge shock, right? It's a shock to wheat prices, a shock to gas prices, a shock to oil prices, and it's external to the stance of monetary policy. Fine, right? Now you look at this and you can say this is transitory. That sentence makes it very clear who understands basic Econ 101 level economics and who doesn't, because transitory inflation shock doesn't mean that prices are going to go back down. It just means that prices have gone up. They're not going to go back up further. So once the transition to a higher level of prices for these goods is done, there's not going to be endogenous dynamics for it, right? However, the problem here was as inflation was creeping up, and this is not the issue of ex post, they turned out to be not so correct. Inflation turned out to be more persistent than they anticipated. It's a problem of the central bank's language in referring to inflation. When you talk about inflation as transitory, we're talking about of inflation as something that is happening to you, that is external to you. And that is categorically a huge, large, unforgivable, actually, mistake. The problem is with that transitory talk, the only reason you're saying inflation is transitory is to justify your inaction, which may be correct. Inaction might be the optimal policy if you perceive inflation as properly transitory. But it's very clear to everyone, I hope, that when the central bank says, yeah, inflation, it happens, okay? It really gives the signal that I have nothing to do, or I don't care, or, that inflation business, not really my business. And that's a huge mistake, okay? Because when as central bankers were saying inflation is transitory, the whole world was hearing, and we're gonna watch this the way you're watching this. It's happening to us as it's happening to you, okay? But the relationship between central banking and inflation is never this, right? Inflation is central banking core business. And so there is a correct version of that sentence that central bankers kind of caught on belatedly, which is inflation is transitory, fine, but if in case it turns out not to be, we will make it transitory. Always own up to inflation. And I thought this was a very much correlated mistake in advanced economy central banking. when inflation was going up in the first time. Because let me tell you, I also thought inflation would be transitory. But I also thought this is not the way to communicate transitoriness, right? And that's the issue about losing your inflation anchor, right? Because whenever the central bank begins to talk about inflation as external altogether, then the public's perception of the policy rule gets all over the place. Because if your central bank is saying, yeah, you're inflation, whatever, it's very difficult to think of cases where inflation isn't whatever and understand how your central bank is going to react to it, okay? So many types of self-inflicted wounds, some of them are non-central banking problems, like dumping a ton of fiscal policy stimulus on an already overheating economy. Nonetheless, central banks need to respond to this. But one, I think, very recent and common one was getting yourself to the point of losing control of expectations because you keep on referring to inflation as transitory, hence external to you, and the public really wants to hear you soothe them, right? We will make sure that it's transitory. These are not contradictory statements. And it was important for central banks to say, we're still here, we're in control, right? And not doing that, I thought, was self-inflicted. What else is a self-inflicted wound? Effectively, picking a fight with decades of monetary policy understanding leads to sizable self-inflicted wounds. And this is going to be the Turkish case. I would imagine all of you will be aware of some of it, especially in the past couple of years, when the central bank was consciously and deliberately cutting interest rates and saying we're cutting interest rates so that inflation is going to go down. This really is the poster child of neo-Fisherian disinflation, not quite in these words. But neo-Fisherianism actually requires keeping interest rates lower than they would be conditional on the state of the economy. And that we have been doing for longer than a decade. So this has been a very long-running experiment. Let me tell you about that. This is a paper that I wrote with two of my colleagues here, Burçin Kısacıkoğlu and Samsop Lee. It's titled Exchange Rate and Inflation Under Weak Monetary Policy. This is the polite way of saying it. And Turkey Verifies theory is, let me ask you, all of you have learned, many of you I know, many of you I don't. And even the people I don't, if you're here, you have studied basic undergraduate macroeconomics. So here's a question for you. Imagine that as inflation is going up, a country says, well, you know what? We're going to cut interest rates, or let's commit to not raising interest rates, okay? Inflation, external shock, say, for example, transitory happens. We're not going to touch it, okay? What would happen to inflation? What would happen to the inflation process? And what would happen to the exchange rate of that country? I'm going to argue that quietly, you said, inflation is going to go through the roof and the exchange value of the country's currency is going to go up, meaning the currency is going to be depreciated. Now, that answer is not mechanical. It actually hinges on quite substantial theory that today we summarize with the new Keynesian theory. Okay? There is actually an alternative answer to this, which is inflation is going to go down and the currency is going to appreciate. And that answer will be given by Martin Uribe and Stephanie Schmidt-Grohe, where if this is indeed a credible promise to keep interest rates low forever, you're going to trigger the neo-Fisherian mechanism that is going to lower inflation and appreciate your currency, okay? Which, in our case, has not happened. So let's talk about whether both those answers might be correct and under what circumstances, right? And that's what this paper is. So the paper, I'm going to walk you through very fastly of the many things in this paper, hoping that some of you are going to find some things that I will not talk about today and go and read the paper available on our web pages. Talk about the Fisher effect, neo-Fisher effect, and the new Keynesian model. I'm going to talk about this in some detail, okay? And then talk about why one should see this as an exogenous shock, and in particular, why one should not think of this as fiscal dominance or the fiscal theory of the price level, okay? It really isn't. Then make use of this experiment to say, you know what? this purchasing power parity business, it's something that we love as economists, and it breaks our hearts, and in particular when you're teaching undergrads, for example, right? You know, expectations hypothesis and PPP are two things that the students immediately understand, and they are like, ah, you know, this is so great. And then you have to tell them, yeah, the data hates both of them, okay? But our tests of PPP are usually with currency, country pairs, where the currency between them is supposed to change a tiny, tiny bit because inflation differentials are tiny, right? You know, you're looking at the 80s, 90s Deutsche Mark dollar exchange rate, and your world is, well, you know, inflation was 2.5% here, 3.2% there. Did the exchange rate change 0.7%? Okay, yeah, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but I wouldn't think of this as a huge test of PPP, rather than seeing it as very little identifying variation there. How about picking country pairs where one of the countries has 2%, the other one has, 45%? That's much more of a test, right? For which you're going to need a country that actually has a functioning foreign exchange market and vastly different inflation rates than the rest of the countries you can compare it to. And in this effort to be useful for science, Turkey has provided that experiment. Okay, we're going to use that. We're going to show that PPP actually holds very tightly in that data. And not only that, you can use inflation dynamics to forecast interest rates out of sample and pseudo out of sample. And you can beat the Nisi-Rogov benchmark, which is a very difficult thing to do. Okay, we're going to talk some about why this was happening and talk about governance altogether. Not the strongest part of the paper, but if your country is kind of following the Turkish experience in court packing, taking over the media and making central banking a very politicized affair, who you are, right? There are some lessons for you there. Then we're going to do Taylor rule estimation and say, look at that. The Taylor rule was not satisfied. And we're talking about an indeterminacy there. Talking about indeterminacy is difficult because indeterminacy in this context says anything goes. And if anything goes, then, whatever I show you as the outcome, of course, goes. There is no test. So we're going to rig our basic models very mildly so that they are determinate, but are accommodative of monetary policy, where monetary policy cannot properly react to inflation, okay? And we're going to see that the inflationary outcomes of the kind Turkey has experienced is prescribed by these models. That's the sense in which the title has Turkey verifies theory. Our basic theory indeed will tell us inflation will go through the roof. And I'm going to say, yeah, that's what's happening here, okay? One of the things we're going to do in that regard is to think about an asymmetric case, because the world that Turkish people have seen, or if you're looking at from outside into Turkey, you have seen, isn't where, this is clean indeterminacy, where inflation is all over the place. It's been going up, 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 up. And that's what indeterminacy is, right? Is that we could as well coordinate on very low inflation. That should have happened too. That ain't in the data. So there's clearly some asymmetry where inflation is just going on the upside. And that's the world where we are sad to introduce in the Turkish context, the effective upper bound. Think of a world where rather than the mechanical, the participation constraint implied effective lower bound on inflation, on interest rates, there's a political upper bound on interest rates, meaning when you get a negative shock, you can actually cut rates, that's allowed. But when you get a positive shock, you can't raise them. And thus, you lose control of inflation on the upside, but not on the downside, okay? Then for those of you who have this nerdy interest, there are a whole bunch of event studies where, look at what happened to the financial markets on the day the president said this, on the day the central bank did that. Much to see and hopefully like there, okay? So it's a loaded paper that I'm only going to pick and choose to discuss. The part that I really want to pick and choose is this neo-Fisherian effect. That we wrote this paper, and the first time I presented this, I realized I'm talking about this, but I don't quite understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so we spent some time trying to make sense of what exactly is the Fisher effect, what exactly is the neo-Fisher effect, how do they sit with a new Keynesian model, and under what circumstances one of these effects, two of these effects, all of these things can be correct in the data generating process. Okay, it begins with the Fisher equation. The Fisher equation, although we write this as an equality, it's an identity. It's the definition of the real interest rate. Okay, so this always has to be satisfied. Fine. One of those alwayses is at the steady state, where it says the steady state nominal rate, short rate, is the steady state real rate plus steady state inflation. Okay, I'm not going to pick a fight with that. Now I'm going to read a bit of theory, and hopefully not terribly controversially, I'm going to say, I know this is not purely straightforward, but I'm going to say steady state real rate is exogenous to monetary policy. Okay, there is of course now work that recognizes, if your monetary policy creates a recession, that recession is going to have, hysteresis effects, whatnot. But let's abstract from that for the moment. That's not what is interesting here. Okay, and say this R bar is whatever it is, marginal product of capital, growth rate of economy, not the monetary policy stance. Okay, the moment I say it, if it so happens that the steady state nominal rate is set lower by the central bank, it has to be the case that steady state inflation is also lower. This is the Fisher effect, not the neo-Fisher effect. This is the Fisher effect that says steady state lower nominal rates are only consistent with steady state lower inflation. Okay, that's there. Fine. This still follows from the definition and has to be correct. You can think of this both ways, right? If you're trying to reflate, if you're trying to get it out of a deflation trap, then the Fisher equation will say, if you're able to have higher short rates in the long run, you're going to have higher inflation in the long run. Okay, fine. The neo-Fisher effect is an argument that takes this and through a backwards induction mechanism relates it to inflation today. Okay, and the argument is this: your Phillips curve is inflation today is blah blah plus expected inflation. Now think of a time close to the steady state, but not at the steady state, where the central bank has committed to lowering interest rates permanently. Through the Fisher effect, this must relate to lower inflation at the steady state. Hence, in the near future now, you're perceiving lower inflation, which must mean that inflation today has to go down. That's your expectations augmented Phillips curve. But then that process works backwards, right? And implies that inflation will be lower tomorrow in expectation. Hence, inflation today will be lower. Thus, by committing to a path of lowering interest rates forever, you end up not only lowering inflation at the steady state, you also lower inflation today. This is the neo-Fisherian idea of disinflation. Okay? Now, that argument is correct and also very unsettling, because now it went completely counter to your gut feeling or learned answer that if a country goes out and says, yeah, inflation is high today, but whatever, we're going to cut interest rates and keep them low from here to kingdom come, inflation, and you all thought inflation is going to go through the roof, right? I just gave you the mechanism of, inflation is going to go down. Okay, so what gives? Okay. Martin and Stephanie not only make this argument, not quite in this way, but this is the gist of their argument, but also say this effect is present in the data. It actually happens. Right? Now, what gives? Our thinking is one ought to think of this through the lens of the Taylor rule. Okay? This Taylor rule also has to be satisfied every period because of the presence of the shock term here. Okay, so it has to be, there should be an R bar here, I apologize for this, right? The nominal rate today is the nominal rate at steady state plus, I wrote down the simplest Taylor rule I could imagine. So it only reacts to inflation, but I could have output deviations, whatever you like in there. That's not the point, okay? the interest rate is going to react with this coefficient by pi to the inflation today, that it's deviation from the inflation target today, plus some shock, right? So if I'm erring here, that is, I'm not following this rule exactly, well, I will still have to be following the rule exactly because the shock is going to make it fit, okay? Now ask, if the neo-Fisherian idea is this IT is going to be lower forever, okay? Something on the right-hand side of this has to go down as well. What is it? Okay, start from the idea, the only reason you might want to do the neo-Fisherian disinflation is your inflation is high. IT is much about pi bar, okay? What could happen? What is going to move around, okay? So candidate one is the shock, right? Answer one, it cannot be, because the interest rate has gone down permanently, and I cannot engineer that with permanently negative shock to the Taylor rule. It violates the definition of the shock as being unforecastable, mean zero, okay? So that isn't it. What else can it be? What it can be is the inflation target has gone down and steady state inflation has gone down with it, okay? But the machinery is here, I'm not going to differentiate between the target and steady state, but it goes from the target to the steady state. The inflation target has gone down credibly, therefore, perceived steady state inflation has gone down. Therefore, this neo-Fisherian machinery is working, and therefore, the inflation today is going down in lockstep with the target inflation. Thus, this pi bar is lower, and this pi t is lower, but they are both lower by the same amount. Thus, no contribution from this term altogether here. However, since perceived steady state inflation, the inflation target is lower, the constant here, steady state nominal rate, is also lower, and thus the Taylor rule is satisfied. We're done. This is how neo-Fisherian disinflation is possible. In fact, this is also how neo-Fisherian reflation is possible. It works through affecting the inflation target. It's a credible change in the inflation target. Indeed, this is exactly how, not in these words, Martina Stefani extract this in the data. They run a VAR and they say, we're going to label as permanent changes in the monetary policy when I see, or when we see, both ends of the yield curve move in the same direction, okay? So it's going to be those parallel shifts in the yield curve that I will label as permanent changes in the interest rate. But parallel changes in the yield curve are results of changes in the perceived inflation target. This is something macrofinance people have known for a long, long time. If you're trying to match the level shifts in the yield curve, you better have a time-varying inflation target, okay? Now, here are two things to remember then. Neo-Fisherianism isn't like, I don't know, MMT, okay? It's not completely kooky. Basic, correct, well-understood macro is actually consistent with neo-Fisherian, in my case, disinflation. How is that going to work? It doesn't work by lowering interest rates, la, 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 la. It works by being able to credibly change the inflation targets and therefore concurrently being able to lower the interest rates. Causality goes from the target to the policy rate. So the neo-Fisherian question, the good question becomes, can you do it the other way around? Can the central bank go out and say, I'm going to keep, think of the path of the state and the associated path of the short rate. I'm going to keep rates lower than that permanently, okay? Will this lead to a change in the inflation target? And the answer is, I don't know. It may. And if it does, you're going to end up with your neo-Fisherian disinflation, and good for you. But there is no machinery that forces the public to conclude from your policy action that, ooh, inflation target has gone down. I'm convinced that inflation will fall. So the really good question becomes, what if the public says, the central bank is cutting the nominal rate, and my understanding of the target hasn't changed at all? What happens then? And the answer is, it has to be that phi pi goes down. The only way this Taylor rule is going to be satisfied, since I can have permanent negative shocks, and since phi bar hasn't changed, the only way the nominal rate is lower is that the public concludes that here is inflation, here is the target, the interest rate should be going up, but the central bank said it's not going to go up as much as it should, or it's going to go down something, right? The only way this is happening is my central bank is not as responsive to inflation as I thought it was. That is, in lay people's terms, phi pi is lower. What happens then? What happens then is your graduate macro professor begins to get very itchy, because if phi pi is sufficiently low, you're going to end up with new Keynesian indeterminacy. And that's not the world you want to be in. However, that's the way this whole machinery fits together. And that's the only way this whole machinery fits together. Because on the other side, I still have the Fisher effect that still says, if your central bank is lowering the path of interest rates permanently, since that permanence carries over to the steady state inflation has to go down. There is now a steady state with lower inflation. How is this possible? It is possible because that steady state is no longer something that you have a path that forces you to that steady state. Under indeterminacy, your economy is going to jump around in this bowl, right? And therefore, although there is the steady state, and one of those points is that steady state, there is no force that pushes you to that steady state. People are going to expect inflation to be here, it's going to be there. They're going to expect inflation to be here, it's going to be there. So the question, what is the half-life of the inflation differential between here to the steady state, is you can't answer that question. All times are infinity, okay? This I found very useful once we spent enough time to understand this. Okay? Now I can take that and use this to talk about the Turkish monetary policy. So point one is, was this, fiscal theory to price level, fiscal dominance? I'm going to show you that this crazy experiment started at about 2010. Okay? At about 2010, I apologize, debt to GDP was about 40-ish% and going down. Right? So it's very difficult to make a case that fiscal stance was forcing easier monetary policy. Not only that, I don't have this in the slides, but it's in the paper if you're interested. The financial markets also were very cognizant of this. So Turkish CDS spreads were going down like crazy. Those things, of course, are very volatile, but you can see the low frequency change. And Turkish rating was going up. So somewhere here, Turkey became investment grade, okay? Clearly not cases where your fiscal policymaker is saying, for me to make ends meet, you have to cut rates, because you could borrow as much as you wanted to internationally, and you did not need to borrow, okay? So this wasn't the fiscal theory of price level, and this was a pure policy error, and the central bank was aware of it. I apologize for the Turkish, this is from a different paper, but this shows all kinds of weird policy actions the Turkish central bank took, including here, having a very wide target corridor range, okay? So this is about 8 percentage points wide, and saying, I'm going to make the overnight rate, the interbank rate, hit bounds randomly. Essentially, the central bank was saying, I'm cutting interest rates here and keeping them low, and this is terrible. I should not be doing this. So I need to do something contractionary. I understand that uncertainty is contractionary, so I'm going to increase uncertainty. Great policy experiment, by the way. Terrible to be experimented on, okay? Here, they said, this isn't working out, so fine, we're badgered into lowering the rates again here. They said, okay, we're cutting rates, but now we're going to make this policy corridor vastly asymmetric. The upper end is going to be way up there, and this is in the release. We're going to allow the effective rate to trade close to the upper end of the corridor, meaning this solid line, which used to be the target rate, this is just a number now, okay? Because we're not going to target the target rate. Essentially, the policy rate is now the upper end of the corridor. And notice that this is about a 700 basis point rate hike. Why are they doing this? Because they are pushed into keeping the announced policy rate low. And these are not stupid central bankers. They understand the harm they're causing, okay? So in this paper, we then begin to use, in this period, this as the policy rate, okay? But even this is too low. All right. So now, hopefully I convinced you that Turkey was undertaking this, mad experiment of low interest rates, which led to high inflation and various things. So now I could ask, what about exchange rates, okay? Let's look at this. This is the exchange rate. This is the lira-dollar exchange rate against the exchange rate of a basket of other emerging market countries. So what this says is, it really was Turkey, okay? And it really began to happen in 2010-ish, okay? Same thing for inflation. Now, this is the level of the exchange rate. This is annual inflation, so they're not, right? This is not the price level on the right-hand side. So now I could ask, let me run a, nice, polite, bivariate unobserved components model. And the thing I'm interested in is, I'm not going to walk you through this model, but I'm going to have trends of inflation and exchange rate change. I'm going to ask, what is the correlation of the shocks that hit these two processes? Okay, and the answer is going to be, holy cow, 1. It is the same shock. Okay, and it's not the external shock; it's the internal policy change that is the shock here to the trends, okay? But of course, exchange rate and inflation having the same increments, that's the definition of PPP. PPP holds exactly for the trends of inflation and the exchange rate, okay? Cool, I'm gonna skip this. If you can use then various methods to forecast the exchange rate, random walk, bivariate model, univariate model, whatever, okay? It turns out these are kind of similar. What you're looking at is the time series of the forecast errors themselves. But in a statistical sense, the best one is the univariate unobserved component model in the presence of random walk and random walk return, okay? So we do beat the Misi-Rogov benchmark when inflation is this out of the whack. All right. This says, yeah, central bankers was going whack, and everything in the country was going down the drain anyway, right? If you're interested in the political economy of this, you may want to take a look at this. All right. Well, I'm gonna skip this, but I want to show you this.
We're running a bit short of time.
I know. So I thought my time is up to half past, and I'd like to leave some time for questions. Is that okay? I don't hear you. You're muted. Which, if you're disagreeing with me, I'm happy not to hear you.
Yeah, so okay. I think we should leave some time for questions. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So a couple more minutes,
30 minutes
just to say the interesting stuff. Yeah. Good. Okay. So now I have a Taylor rule with time varying inflation target, output gap, whatever you want. My interest is in this coefficient. Okay. And estimating this rule isn't trivial, and the way we do it isn't exactly correct either. But we have reason to think that it's correct enough. Okay. But this is what you were wondering about. And what you see is here I have 1, okay? Up to the global financial crisis, I cannot reject the null that this coefficient is 1, okay? And then the world is a mess, but starting in 2010 or so, I can easily reject it being 1. And then from then after, I can't reject the null that the Turkish central bank is not reacting to inflation at all, okay? This is the grandparent of you're going to have massive indeterminacy, right? So what happens then? All right, so we're going to have 2 models that I'd like to tell you about very briefly. One is a model of regime switching. One of the regimes is in itself indeterminate, but the other one is sufficiently determinate that overall I have determinacy, okay? So I don't call them indeterminate and determinate. I call them weak policy and good policy. Now I ask, imagine you get dinged by the same inflation shock in the weak regime versus the good regime. What happens? Inflation goes through the roof in the weak regime. On the other hand, this is symmetric. If you were dinged in the other way, right, you should see inflation falling too much, which is not in the data. Then we say, well, this was because the central bank was able to counter negative shocks, such as the global financial crisis. But when the time came to raise interest rates, they could not. This is a world of an effective upper bound. What happens under an effective upper bound? What happens is now you have asymmetry, right? Negative shock, you counter it. Positive shock, in the world without the upper bound, you would have raised interest rates. Here, you hit the upper bound, and then you have to say, you know, ooh, I wish I were a central banker with a backbone. While you are saying that, inflation goes through the roof. This is the Turkish case. Theory, rather way, the other way around. Turkey verifies theory, okay? So the new Keynesian model actually has everything you wanted to understand this kind of a huge policy change, right? These are things about the event studies that I'm going to skip, and I'm going to leave you with the conclusion, of which this one I think is particularly important. If you're a theorist, this is important, that even with large changes, the new Keynesian model is very good. If you're an international economist, you might like the PPP. For me, this is the bit, okay? You know, neo-Fisherianism, don't try at home. And this isn't only a problem for, you know, countries that gone off the deep end like Turkey. It's a huge problem for any country where politics takes an interest in the running of the monetary policy. Thank you very much.
Okay, Andrew. I hope my information about your affiliations is correct. Rafael, you are at Brandeis University, but you're currently Deputy Director at the Center for Inflation Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. The title of your talk is Greater Than the Sum of the Parts, Aggregate versus Aggregated Inflation Expectations, ? The floor is yours. We are perfectly on time, half an hour presentation, and then discussion, please.
Thank you so much, first for having me and for the kind introduction. With a slight correction, I no longer officially work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, but I am still associated with them. And the topic I'm going to talk about is inflation expectations, which is a part of a series of projects that has come out of my activity mainly there. And particularly, I'm going to talk about greater than the sum of its parts, aggregate versus aggregated inflation expectations, which is joint work with Alex Dietrich at Notec, Christian Mithers, Rob Rich, and Michael Weber. And the usual disclaimer does apply here. So what's particular going on in this paper? We're really doing something very simple, which is a measurement of a very dry and boring object, inflation expectations. And in doing this exercise, we create a novel data set of type of micro as well as macro inflation expectations. And by microinflation expectations, we denote the inflation expectations for each major personal consumption expenditure category. Whereas by macro inflation expectations, we denote the more conventional aggregate inflation expectations, as well as spending plans, which we also elicit alongside those aggregate inflation expectations. And then based on these data, we ask, how do microinflation expectations relate to macro type inflation expectations in terms of inflation, as well as in consumption spending plans? And our main findings on these exercisings are the three following findings. First, macro inflation expectations tend to exceed micro inflation expectations and are more volatile. Their internal aggregation mechanism is related to social demographics, complexity of tasks, as well as heuristics. And we find that micro expectations contain additional information about consumption plans that are not contained in the conventionally measured macro inflation expectations. So why would we care about this? One reason why you might care about this lies in the implications for measurement of expectations. Our results suggest that rather than measuring abstract macro expectations, one might also want to focus on measuring micro expectations. And the reason is that macro expectations concern abstract, uncertain variables which leads humans to use heuristics in their estimation, which are well known to be subject to biases. By contrast, micro expectations concern very tangible and often better understood variables, which might be less prone to the use of heuristics and subject to much easier recall of relevant experiences. So overall, this calls for a theory of optimal expectations measurement, which I think is worth developing more. Another reason you might care about is obviously policy, where expectations at least feature prominently in many models. And in particular, from a very practical point, our micro expectations data imply a different estimate for the intertemporal elasticity of substitution via estimation of an Euler equation from the conventionally estimated one when one uses these conventional macro expectations for inflation. And obviously, this is a key parameter for the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy. In particular, our micro-based estimates imply that monetary policy may underpredict inflation volatility by about 25% in a very stylized New Keynesian model relative to what we would get if you used a macro-based conventional estimate. And then at a more abstract level, I think our work also provides complementary and novel evidence, which does not support the rationality of aggregate inflation expectations. There is a very important seminal paper by Quabillon and Gurkainak who reject full information and rational expectations by pointing out, by comparing inflation expectations and inflation realizations and pointing out that forecast errors are autocorrelated, so some information is left on the table. Our analysis rejects rational inflation expectations by pointing out first, an inconsistency of micro and macro expectations under plausibly rational aggregation schemes. And then second, also that micro and macro expectations contain different information. Right, so let me just start with what we're doing here. Right in the data, which is basically a module on category inflation expectations that we have added to Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland's daily consumer expectations tracker, which I started during my time in Cleveland. It's still going on. I'm going to focus on expectations for categories starting in 2020 and going until last fall. And as I said, this measurement is continuing, and we also have aggregate inflation expectations conventionally measured since March 2020. Overall, this is a representative survey, about 18,000 consumers, excluding all the treatments, and they're representative according to age, gender, race, income, education, and region. And we also have survey weights to account for any sampling and accuracy. So let me tell you what we measure and then how we measure this. First, we measure conventional aggregate macro inflation expectations over the next 12 months, and we elicit both point and density forecasts following the New York Fed's survey of consumer expectations. So let me show you what this question is, or remind you. It's very straightforward. Over the next 12 months, do you think there will be inflation or deflation? And then upon a choice of the two outcomes, respondents are asked what they expect inflation to be, and they write in their best estimate. In addition, and that is new, we ask for category for the microtype inflation expectations over the next 12 months for 11 personal consumption categories in the PCE data. And these categories cover the entire basket of consumption, and we subsume just a few minor categories to limit cognitive burden. So what are these categories? For example, there are gasoline and other energy goods, healthcare, motor vehicles. And in our survey, we always give an example to make clear what we mean. So motor vehicles and parts such as cars and SUVs. So to, just to be sure what the people understand a little bit better what we're referring to. And along this, we also elicit consumption spending plans over the next 12 months for total consumption as well as services and non-durables. And we also ask for category weights, either by spending or by importance. So for example, we ask consumers in terms of consumption spending, how much money do you spend on each of the following broad consumption categories during the last month, and then they can indicate for each of these 11 categories, which I just showed you, how much they estimate to have spent, which we can then normalize to have weights. And let me move on. So let me show you particularly our main question. So in order to elicit category inflation expectations, we ask respondents 12 months from now, what do you think will have happened to the price of the following items? And then to mimic the New York Fed structure, we give them a choice of increase and decrease for each of these categories. And then they can write in their estimate. So before I go into some of the results, let me step back and show you how we conceptualize the model of inflation, the formation of inflation expectations here on the individual side. The individuals have an information set, and they have different functions: P consumption, P aggregate, P category, which they use to construct expectations, for example, about consumption growth, about aggregate inflation, or particular categories. And we are interested, so we elicit, we impose no assumption on these functions, and we elicit these three objects: aggregate consumption plans, aggregate inflation expectations, and category expectations. And then we use this, the responses to gauge the consistency of inflation expectations and their formation in two levels. First, internally, by testing consistency between aggregate inflation expectations and aggregated inflation expectations. So this is this dotted box here, by asking in particular, what's the best fitting aggregator, A, that gets us from here to here as a rational type of aggregation. And of course, we can also dig a little bit deeper and ask what factors might explain any inconsistencies that may point to cognitive boundedness. And we also gauge consistency externally by estimating an Euler equation. Here is T2, asking which measure basically best predicts spending plans, which will point us to where the information is, but also show whether there's a consistency across domains with consumption and inflation, which of course we care about for policy. But let me show you first what these in aggregate and category inflation expectation series look like. And then so the next step, we can aggregate them and compare them. Basic takeaway here is that these aggregate inflation expectations exceed categories. They have higher means and much more dispersed than any individual category in the cross-section, but also in the time series. And one insight that I find really striking is that if you look at the distribution, 40% of individuals aggregate the categories such that the aggregate expectations, such that the aggregate expectations lie outside the range of all the individual categories. In particular, 25% respondents are above their range and 15% are below. So this really suggests there's no easy way to have a linear aggregation of expectations. So let me show you some numbers here. In this table, I'm showing you aggregate and category inflation expectations, their means, their cross-sectional, as well as the time series dispersion. And these are the 11 categories. You can see that the aggregate mean is higher than all the individual categories, as well as more dispersed. In the recent period, obviously, the gasoline price is a little bit more dispersed, but in earlier period, that's not the case. And the time series also shows that very clearly. So let me actually show you the time series means. So here I'm showing you two panels. On the left, the durable and non-durable goods, on the right, services. And you see on both in black the aggregate inflation expectations, the conventional measure from the New York Fed. And we're showing you an 11-day moving average, super robust and survey weighted. And the black line is obviously the same in both panels. And in contrast, I'm showing you the different categories on the left in color for durables and non-durables, on the right for services. And you can see that basically the aggregate exceeds the individual categories. And can also see the dispersion for the aggregate in black for the same two panels. And on the right, again, contrasted with the different categories. And basically there's disagreement on aggregate expectations, which is higher than for most categories. Always it'd be interesting to see how this time series develop. Let me go a little bit more into detail to describe these series. So here I'm looking at the means for aggregate and category expectations by demographics, particular gender, whether the household whether the person reports to be the grocery shopper in the household, by their education and their income. And in top you see the aggregate inflation expectations. One thing that strikes you is that for each of these demographic categories, the gaps between the different subcategories are much higher at the aggregate than in the individual level. So the gender, for example, is a big female to male gap, versus for the different categories, it's actually not that large. And that's generally true. You also see that for education, as well as for income, there's somewhat differing trends by aggregate versus category. So, for example, a low-income, a low-educated respondent has higher inflation expectations, but that's not necessarily true across all the categories. The same is true here for income. And you see consistently at the aggregate and the category levels that the salience of shopping experiences, which tends to fall onto women, leads them to have higher inflationary expectations for both the categories and the aggregate. You can also look at dispersion by these same demographic categories, and you can see that these patterns are a bit more consistent for the categories and the aggregate. So here you don't see these differences, but you also do notice there's a much wider gap in the aggregate again compared to all the categories. And finally, an interesting demographic to look at is age. So here I have 4 age categories and the expectational means as well as the dispersion. And you can see that there are differences across age. In the aggregate, it's, I would say, somewhat nonlinear. Whereas for the categories, you see a relatively clear increase with age, but there are no differences in dispersion, which is declining as people become older. Okay, so now I've shown you in great detail what some of the properties of these different measurements, and now I'm going to aggregate the categories up and compare them to the conventional aggregate inflation expectations and try to understand what this is coming from. So there are 3 main findings basically emerge, which is that aggregated micro-based inflation expectations are much closer to 0 than the aggregate, while they're also less dispersed. And then second, there's a positive aggregation inconsistency if we choose plausibly rational aggregations pointing to internally inconsistent beliefs, and in particular, equal weighted aggregation schemes provide the best fit, which casts doubt on the inflation expectations being rational in the aggregate. And of course, I'm also looking a little bit deeper where I'm showing that inconsistency varies with uncertainty as well as some socio-demographic factors. So how do we aggregate up these category inflation expectations? We use variations in sets of weights, constructing 8 measures of aggregated inflation expectations for each respondent based on their 11 category expectations. And we have 2 sets of weights, the plausibly rational aggregations. We can use expenditure weights or importance weights or PCE weights, which you would think for an average should closely match the aggregate inflation expectations. I also have a set of behavioral aggregations where we might impose equal weights, which neglects the difference in weights. We also use second highest category expectations, so basically order statistics, and that obviously captures salience of price statistics, price changes. And then we focus particularly also on core and non-core weights, which captures a very particular salient price changes, namely for gas, energy, and grocery prices. So this is one of the key figures in the paper. I'm showing you aggregate versus aggregated measures according to what I just described. And you see on the x-axis the aggregated measures binned into, I think, 15 groups or so. And on the left, you see the different plausibly rational aggregation schemes. On the right, you see the behavioral schemes. And very clearly, you see there is a positive aggregation inconsistency for the plausibly rational aggregations, whereby aggregate expectations, as they conventionally elicited, exceed our aggregated expectations, but they do tend to move one-to-one, and there's maybe a little bit of a nonlinearity at the tails. And on the right, you see that the behavioral ones look a little bit closer, and in particular, we do some statistics. You can show that and we do this in the paper. Obviously, the equal weight aggregator provides a really close match in the cross section. And this is interestingly in line with the literature that looked at basically equal weights and forecasting studying in the medical literature, where you had an expert opinion and versus somebody who just sort of took correctly aligned predictors and sort of simply computed an average prediction to get the right diagnosis. And basically these equal weights based on individual categories did much better than sort of this aggregate expert view. So I found this really curious. So this may extend to multiple domains. And here I'm showing you aggregate versus aggregated measures over time, in particular their means. And again, we have plausibly rational versus behavioral aggregation schemes in the two panels. And the black is the conventionally elicited measure. And you can see that, again, there's a positive aggregation inconsistency where aggregate expectations, the black line, exceed the plausibly rational aggregations. And they're also like a lot more volatile. And actually, it's also somewhat more pronounced in the recent high inflation period. And we're curious to see what's going to happen next. And statistically, again, here we find that also in the time series, an equal weighted aggregation scheme provides the closest match to the conventionally reported and measured aggregate inflation expectations. And here I'm just showing you a dispersion, again, for the two aggregation schemes compared with the aggregate. And you can see that the dispersion of aggregate inflation expectations is basically much higher than that for the aggregated measures, perhaps, except for some period here in April. Stepping back, what is potentially driving these processes of aggregation inconsistency? I have, we can try to analyze this inconsistency through individual level data and shed a little bit of light on this. And we do this by defining the consistency as the difference between the conventionally elicited aggregate and the aggregated expectations according to our schemes here. And if we exclude order statistics, which may just turn this very negative here, we see that this gap on average ranges between 68 basis points and 1.6 percentage points. And if you look at the magnitude, which can, let's include order statistics, you get a very, very large discrepancy here. And I'm going to take that discrepancy at the individual level, I'm going to regress it on all the survey covariates that we measure, which include socio-demographic factors and measures of task complexity. I'm just going to show here one representative table that uses expenditure weights for aggregation, but the results actually fairly generalized to all the other aggregation schemes. And moreover, out of the many regressors that we have, I'm only showing the ones that come out very significantly and are very interesting to look at. So you see in these two columns a measure of inconsistency regressed, and that it is highly related to, if you look at the second column, to age and education, which both decrease the inconsistency. So this may be related to some mental abilities, and perhaps there's a wisdom of age here. At the same time, you also see that aggregate inflation expectations uncertainty, which we measure through the second way of eliciting inflation expectations via density, forecast density, as well as the dispersion at the individual level across the 11 categories, both increase in consistency also quite significantly. So this might be related to the complexity of making these forecasts, which from psychology we know is reflected usually in higher reported uncertainty. And this is the point I just want to emphasize a little bit more with these two figures here. And I'm showing you two panels on the left, the uncertainty that we get from the forecast density at the individual level and binned into, again, I think 10 or 15, 12, 15 groups. So that's on the left-hand side on the x-axis, and on the y-hand side, on the left-hand side, you have the inconsistency. And you can see very clearly that is increasing across all the aggregation schemes. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the same aggregate inconsistency plotted against the standard deviation at the individual level across each respondent's 11 categories, and again binned into these categories. Again, see a very strong positive relationship here. So that doesn't really have to be, I mean, in the data, you've seen the regressions just now, but it could just be a flat line. And so that's not the case. So in the last couple of minutes, let me just say, why should we care? Well, besides the implications and questions, I think we should ask for measurement, as well as the extent to which these aggregate inflation expectations are plausibly rational or not. There are obviously implications for modeling and policy. I'm going to show you this by looking at one application, which is an estimation of the Euler equation, where you use category-based expectations rather than conventional aggregate measures, and that yields better fit of spending forecasts. So really what the Euler equation estimates, and these estimates are different also from what we normally get in terms of the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. And I'm just going to plug that into a super simple model to show that that is quantitatively relevant. So how do we show that? Trying to assess which measure of inflation expectation predicts spending plans best. Well, we run a horse race by looking at conventional aggregate expectations or aggregated measures. And for that, we also have to use additional survey data, which is the expected changes in spending that I pointed to earlier. And we estimate a plain Euler equation where we regress changes in spending plans on various measures of expectations, various household characteristics, which include socio-demographic factors, income, and so on, as well as time fixed effects, so interest rates and so on are captured here. And then obviously you note that since we have spending here rather than real consumption growth, you can convert that and elicit and directly get at the intertemporal elasticity by looking at 1 minus this coefficient here. So how well does any inflation expectation measure explain the spending data? Well, we assess this using the RCEA information criterion. And this is a table that we get, which shows you the estimates in the first column for the intertemporal elasticity of substitution for the aggregate and the 11 categories. And then various measures of fit, in particular the RCEA criterion here in the third last column. And you notice that all the category-based estimates are lower, and they have they're better predictors at spending than the aggregate measure. Now, which one is the best? Well, you can look at the different measures, and it turns out to be equal weighting. But I wouldn't make. It is actually quite curious that because of this earlier literature that I mentioned in a completely different domain. But I think the general takeaway is that all of these measures that are based on the category inflation expectations just perform better in terms of prediction, and they all have different estimates. So I'm just going to skip this here for the sake of time. And then to assess in very simple quantitative terms, the implications for monetary and fiscal policy, I'm going to look at a case of monetary policy, where we find potentially very large welfare-relevant effects, and we literally take a standard textbook Galli model We take different estimates of the intertemporal elasticity, and we see what the different welfare relevant metrics in inflation volatility and output gap volatility are. So if we use an aggregate conventionally estimated based measure, we get this, for example, the inflation volatility here in red. If we use our equal weight measure, we get a very different volatility of welfare, as well as also a higher volatility for the output gap. So clearly there's some difference here. And we've also shown you here third line a different recent estimate, which also implies different outcomes. Of course, there are many other aspects of policy, for example, thinking about forward guidance that are also directly impacted by this intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So to conclude, I've shown you evidence, I've shown you a survey of microtype category inflation expectations. We find that aggregate inflation expectations do exceed all of these aggregated category expectations, which by themselves are less volatile and dispersed, and there is a significant inconsistency between aggregate and aggregated measures, which is related to uncertainty, but also to individuals of different socioeconomic status. And finally, I've tried to argue that if we estimate an Euler equation, we see, for example, that this measurement matters, and this category expectation actually contain additional information, which may imply coincidentally large welfare relevant effects. Thank you very much.